Good morning, everybody. It's nice to welcome you here, and it's particularly nice to see some old familiar faces that have returned to honor Domingo Milella. My name is Stephen Frailey. I'm the editor of Dear Dave magazine, and I also have the great pleasure of occupying a couple of different academic positions at School of Visual Arts in photography. But enough about me. Let's talk about Domingo. Domingo Milella, as you probably know, is represented by the Grimaldi Gavin Gallery in London and has had 3 solo exhibitions at the gallery. And he's also had 2 at Tracy Williams Gallery here in New York. His work has been exhibited at the Venice Biennale and at Les Racontes des Arts, which I'm probably mispronouncing, published in the New York Times Magazine, Foam Magazine, Dear Dave, and Wallpaper. He is a graduate from the BFA Photography Department at SVA in 2005, and we gather here today to celebrate the publication of his very beautiful monograph published by Steidl in 2014. Without any further delay, Domingo's going to talk for a while, and then he and I are going to have a conversation together, and also including all of you in that conversation. So, without any further delay, please welcome Domingo Milella.
Hello. It's almost talking to a family because it's most of affections sitting in the audience, so we'll make it intimate. But I still have to enter the body of work that we will do with just something very brief I wrote this morning. On Mondays, a few blocks down on 23rd Street, during my freshman year, 14 years ago, there was a lecture series. It was one of my favorite classes, to sit in the dark. Here it's a little bit brighter, but there it was darker in the old theater. To sit in the dark and listen to the adventures of these artists. Today I'm honored and I'm thankful with Stephen and Maria to make this possible. New York has given me a passport to my own culture, strangely, and arriving at SVA from a conformist traditional culture like Italy, it was very liberating, challenging, and new. It allowed me to look back slowly and clearly to my own culture, as much as it showed me that a culture can never really enter one other culture. We need confrontation and freedom to find our roots. 10 years after my graduation, I want to thank you guys for this possibility and this lesson, which includes freedom, expression, and art. I will start, weirdly enough, chronologically, because my work, I think, essentially about time. And this is the picture with which I usually begin from 2004. It's the apartment buildings across the window of the house where I grew up. And it represents the suburbs of any city, but in this case it's my city, so it's almost like being in love and being affectionate with something anonymous or generic. But the weird thing is that also my family was part of the entrepreneur endeavor to build this, so in a certain way, since early on I discovered that the interest that picture allowed me to explore was love, belonging, through architecture and through the representation of what it can mean. But in a certain way, my body of work really begins in 2004 with a very special experience that it's entangled with SVA as well. I was unhappy about making pictures in New York after 4 years. Pictures were not coming out. Pictures were not interesting. I was mostly photographing in Italy and bringing back to the darkroom on 21st Street apartment buildings like the one where I grew up or different, but it wasn't really evolving what I was looking for. So one day I met, before spring break, Stephen in the elevator of the school, and he said that there was a small school in Mexico City asking us to exchange students. He didn't know anything about this school. He would have gone a few days after, and he said, why don't you organize a group of your friends to go look at this place instead of going on holiday for spring break, just go to Mexico. And eventually I went there, and I asked him on my way back to Mexico to just move me into this university for a whole semester, and that eventually happened. happened, and this early kind of loss of virginity was through this gift he gave me and the coincidence of Mexican culture. This is the square of the three cultures, where the Spaniards built with the same brick of the Mayan, of the Aztec pyramid, the convent of Tlatelolco, and then the Ministry of Internal Affairs of Mexico built his own skyscraper on the top of another twin pyramid. So in a certain way, it's a picture that shows the violence and the body of colonization. But Mexico was a far more liberating environment because it was a city, a village, an archaeological ruin of the present. It looked almost like a medieval, futuristic city. And when I took this picture, still in 2008, it was Mexican culture that showed me and indicated me a way back to Italy, to medieval painting, to Giotto, as if the city was containing a certain kind of archaic memory. And the archaeology that is taken out of the underground, like in this picture, paradoxically comes back to the underground. This is a subway stop called Beautiful Arts, Bellas Artes. This is also Mexico City. I decided in this prolific presentation, because there is many images we will go through, to also include works of other artists in time that connect with some form of sentimental, intellectual, or just aesthetic bridge. This is Cima da Conegliano, a Venetian painter from the late 1400s, famous for its very cold light. Early on in the development of my work, beside architecture, I was very fascinated by funerary architecture. Also because in a certain way, cemeteries are architectural models of each culture that builds them. And they also cannot be dwelled in the present, but they are dwelled by memory. This, I think, relates to another interesting thing I discovered through photography, which is the relationship with memory and writing memory, which it means also building memory. And the cemeteries of Muslim culture build uniform sculptural models with no sex, no hierarchy, no social class. There was something interesting about this elegance and this uniformity of memory. This is in Albania in 2008. It's a strange picture because it's not usual for me to have people. There are very few, but in this case, for me, this picture was a kind of metaphor. There is a family being portrayed in a pristine forest, and this is early on in the development of digital cameras being diffused in the world, and I could see around like a tree with a large camera settled on the land. I always saw things happening around me while photographing. And one thing that happened during the last 10, 15 years, it was the proliferation of other picture takers, other people taking pictures around me. And this image represents in a certain way this moment of picture taking of the others. But water in the back of my camera springs out of a mountain. It's a natural spring, it's called Blue Eye, and this river is born out of nowhere. The main difference between analog and digital is the existence of water. Film cannot be produced without water. Paper cannot be produced without water. Negative cannot be developed without water. Essentially, I think the main distinction between digital and analog is the presence or the absence of water. In 2009, I began probably the most challenging part of this body of work, which was to try to photograph my own country. And Italy has an incredible heritage of image making, and it was hard to do it with photography because also there is an imagery of Italy that regards the sun, the tourism, the leisure, And I wanted to bring pictures of Italy back to some kind of pictorial quality. This is nearby where I grew up. It's called Polignano a Mare. It's a city built like a ship. This is a Rorni horn, petrified glass. It's a series that has different names. They are by Rorni horn. They are called, they are cast of glass, baked to a point in which they become completely transparent. So they're only opaque on the sides, and they are like, they represent this kind of frozen glass that looks the most similar to frozen water. They absorb light and give light out. It's glass, but it's something to do with photography and water, which I think it's probably the connective element. And also, perhaps I choose some of these things just because they're very beautiful. Even though I came to study in the States, something very strange happened to me in New York City, that I was enjoying a lot American photography, but the true encounter for me was with, as an Italian, New York taught me German art in a very strange way, and especially German photography. And this is a picture of the late 70s by Thomas Struth of a street in Düsseldorf, part of a very long series that he did for 20 years called Unconscious Places. But what really matters for me in this picture is this idea that the city can represent its own history. So this kind of post-war grief of Germany is perfectly evident in the architecture and consequentially perfectly evident in the picture. This is an old formation of lava under the Etna in 2008 with the people, young adolescent looking at the sundown. So I think in the development of the work there is an interesting moment after the first years of experiment in which I really start to see that I want to compress extreme different ages and extreme different moments of history, be it geologic, be it archaeologic, with the present. So try to make pictures of the present in dialogue with another time, a much larger time, which can be natural or cultural. Sicily, 2009. And this was a landmark picture in the development of this idea of time. It was like receiving a kind of a slice of a birthday cake, a set of layers in which we go from caves of the Paleolithic to building of the 70s. In the same picture, it's very hard working analogically and working with straight photography. You have to completely surrender to reality. There is no artifice, there is no vanity, there is no lies. It's either the place, it's either the time, it's the here and now that obliges you to make pictures in a certain way. And this was a gift during the first day of January in the province of Taranto, in the region where I'm from, where I found this kind of model of layers, all in one. In 2009, I spent a long time in Cairo, which, like Mexico City, revealed to be this dream under construction, or this dream under destruction, or a sort of ruin of the present. There is an adolescent putting bricks in line at the bottom of the picture. You can see him kneeling down and he's trying to make his own little order in the middle of this kind of catastrophe. He's doing a little bit of a Carl Andre anonymous piece in the middle of the aftermath of an earthquake or the building of a possibility. The desert proceeds and consumes the city. Modernity tried to build a sort of tolerant, sustainable model for the world of mechanic housing, and the ancient culture built something that lasts longer than his own memory. I'm again kind of grateful with Egypt to show me this. As the Arab saying, they use a lot in Cairo, it says, man is afraid of time, but time is afraid of the pyramids. I think that it's still the case. This is Francis Frith. It's interesting that photography, in a certain way, we underestimate the way it was born and the way it came to us. It's born in the same time in which we really become archaeologic cultures, meaning we start to read and decode the most ancient languages, we start to dig systematically the Mediterranean, and we invent moving machines that will change the face of the world. It's interesting, the coincidence of this, the explosion of archaeology and the codification of time with the invention of photography. They come together. I don't know much about it. I just think it's an interesting coincidence. This is again in Cairo, the Copt ghetto, where they recycle garbage by hand, metal, plastic, organic, all gets done by people, by hand, and they live in this kind of futuristic city with satellite dishes and a kind of medieval fortress, which to me looks more of a city of the future than a city of the past. This is a day view of the same neighborhood. They have these cages on the top of buildings that you see there. They are pigeon cages. They collect eggs and they eat pigeons. It's one of the most refined food in the ghetto. This is Antonello da Messina. Continuing in this task to try to photograph Italy, I really couldn't find a position that was constructive about the present, because the present in Italy, like in any other Western country, is really about building roads, new architecture with no identity, and building this kind of weird space of highways and airports and shopping malls. I think this is the dominant cipher of the last 20 years of our civilization. So I actually wanted to defend myself from this, and I tried to travel back in time and bring a vision of the south of Italy that was linked to this archaic and medieval struggle of this town that was built on the top of hills to hide from Ottoman attacks, to hide from the arrival of Longobards and Normans. This kind of defensive nature of the landscape, which is also kind of very poetic and very organic. This is also in the same province next to my city, near in Taranto. It's called Castellaneta. Weird enough, this is the town where the main actor of mute Hollywood movies, Rudolph Valentine, was born. So the most famous of actors in the 30s came from this archaic, lost place that looks almost like more Afghanistan than Europe. And the river comes through the canyon only in winter when there is a lot of rain falling consequentially. This is Pietra Pertosa, also another town hiked up in the mountains between Napoli and Bari, in the center of the south of Italy. Venetian paintings is a great passion of mine. I think this is also Cima da Conegliano, which, like Giovanni Bellini and Mantegna, they were the first to portray this kind of delicate relationship of the mother and child. I mean, this kind of more human sense of compassion, but also meditation and delicacy. I think I was very influenced in this idea of light and this idea of suspended time by this aesthetic. We get now to the last part of this journey that took 10 years, and now it's compressed in a few minutes, where I started accidentally to confront this idea of writing on the landscape or writing on the stone. This is the last inscription of a lost empire, which is called the Hittites. It's from 1200 BC, so it's like 3,200 years ago, and is a father that tells to his son about all the principle and all the ethics of the values of their civilization: wind, blows, snow falls. The writing is slowly disappearing. We can barely decode it. We can barely read it. I met a person that has been working on this inscription for the last 42 years. He has only got through half of it. Van Gogh. Bruce Nauman. This is in Phrygia. It's a stone that has been carved and dwelled by at least 5 different civilizations. In the back of this stone, after 2 years I did this picture, I came back to look at this formation again, and I discovered there was an Hellenistic tomb with Greek inscriptions that I couldn't see the first time I photographed it. So, and this is right across this more important monument, which kind of compresses the whole topic of what I try to do with pictures. We know it's the tomb of King Midas, the Phrygian king that was punished by Zeus because he asked to have the gift of turning everything he touched into gold. He eventually was granted this gift, and he died of hunger. One other myth says he was turned into a donkey. One other myth said he was punished and dissolved in a river. Myths are very imprecise and confusing, but the interesting thing is that the gate to the underworld, or the gate to the afterlife of Midas, is inscribed in this beautiful manner on this form of rock. And I decided to portray myself photographing with a digital camera. It's a self-portrait. Photographing with a digital camera this passage we can't go through. I think we don't understand really what's happening to our culture through digitalization. We don't have a grasp of this. I wanted to make pictures that absorbed at least the questions we confront. The fascinating thing that the inscriptions around the tomb are in an alphabet that we can read, but we don't know the vowels. It's Phrygian, is an old form of Greek and Phoenician mixed together. So it's like a car we can't drive. We can sit in, we can turn it on, but we can't make it go. I thought it was a very good metaphor to talk about the present. So we can read mitas, mida, but we don't have the tools to make it go. Recently, I came across this early version of the Phaedro from Plato, from the 50s. All my philologist friends told me that we read, we know how it sounds like, but we can't say what the inscription of Mida says. I came across this book by chance this summer, and at page 131, this is in Italian, I'm sorry, but Socrates tells to Phaedro that you talk rhetorically just like the inscription above the tomb of Midas. And Phaedro asks Socrates, so what does this inscription says? And it says, the bronze virgin that I am above the tomb of Midas, until water will flow and the tall trees will rise. Here, on this tomb, full of tears, I will tell to the passerbys that Mida here is buried. So in a certain way, what was unreadable for the philologist, what was unreadable for me, has come after 5 years through the pages of Plato. So it kind of smelled like the right path. In Turkey, traveling in Anatolia and traveling in the old Greek part of Turkey, because the Greek world in reality was a much larger community that included most of the central part of Turkey until all of Sicily and at the gates of Naples in the central part of Italy. So it was a much larger world than what we imagine. And the Lycians, which was this remote population in the east-south of Turkey, built these incredible cliff tombs. But the main one in the center that we see from 300 BC was left unfinished. So I thought it was fascinating that a culture so refined and so remote in time left to us something incomplete. And that can't be finished, because of course we can't call the Lycians back to life and their culture to finish this work. The Lycians built interesting funerary monuments because they reproduced the wood house of their daily life. But the wood, of course, has disappeared. We don't have anything of that. But we are left with the cast of the same shape of wood into funerary sculptures on granite. So in a certain way, the support on which we decide to write becomes the meaning. So in this moment of cell phones and social medias and Twitter, it's kind of interesting to think that we say relevant things, but in reality, it's like writing with water on sand. So I have a lot of questions about this idea of writing. This is Pollock. A body of work that influenced me a lot, which is not so well received and I think understood, also by Thomas Struth, is the series he did in the 90s called New Pictures from Paradise, which talks about very similar things that I talked about as far as now. It's this idea of making pictures that show you the impossibility to look through, the idea of paradise as an unreachable utopia, a picture that doesn't show you, but puts you again in the position of the viewer and puts you again in the thinking mode. Instead of offering you a solution, it triggers you a possible answer or a possible reflection. This is Salerno, 1990, by Andreas Gurski. There is not much to explain. It was one of my favorite pictures of Italy I had seen through the history of photography. This is in Kurdistan. It's an early Muslim community coming from Persia and building this very modern black and brown graveyards. And getting to the last part of the work now, I even accelerated in 2012 and 2013, trying to photograph form of writings that were fascinating to me. This is new Assyrian of the kingdom of Urartu, a kingdom in the mountain between Armenia and Iran. And we could say that if there was an iPad 8.8 of ancient writing, this would be it. It was the newest of the oldest form of writing. And then cuneiform eventually disappeared after this version. So it's the most stylized, clean way of writing with cuneiform. But of course, the picture is also about landscape and about the book of landscape, I would call it. And the gravel, I had to move the gravel to clean the space for the photograph, but the gravel eventually is coming back down. The series Bacchus of Cy Twombly. The young portraits of Germans from the middle of the 80s by Thomas Ruff. I think I'm very fascinated by this work of Ruff because I think it's a bit the face of history, or I could say the gaze of history, through the eyes of the state, the eyes of power, or just the eyes of photography. This is Boetti, and it says divine abstractions. And this leads to the last part of the work from 2013, which I'll show you now. This is another self-portrait of me looking at the inscription of an Hittite king that conquered a new land, and he misbehaved, and he wrote above an older inscription of a previous king his own name, and eventually the Assyrian came in and substituted him with an eunuch. But the point is not this. The point is that a king 800 years before Christ makes his signature on this very mysterious and special place on this dormant volcano. Another king 400 years comes afterward and makes his own sign above the sign of the previous one. And when I took the picture, I was absolutely unaware of this. I just did it by heart. But actually, I was also here on the right trail. So it's me looking at this inscription on lava stone. The Hittite always chose lava as the support of their pages. So basalt was their own paper. And they always chose places perfectly aligned with underground rivers or with the sunrise and the sundown. This work made me think a lot about a beautiful probably my favorite work of Michelangelo, which is the Sacrestia Nuova in Florence, where he portrays this idea of time, and the young captain of the Medici family, Lorenzo, is portrayed as the meditative. Day and night are represented as female and man on the side of the sepulchres. Underground rivers for the Hittite were incredibly important. They thought that where a river would come out of the land was a sign of divine prophecy or divine abundance, but also where a river would disappear was a way to communicate with the underworld. This is an inscription where a king and a queen try to make a deal, offering food and water to the gods. The fascinating thing about Hittites is they're like comic books. What they say is represented above the heads of the figures, so it's like a comic book from 1600. They imitated Egyptian hieroglyphs, but used Babylonian grammar and Assyrian verbs. They mixed a whole knowledge of the past into something kind of free and new. So they're like the most free of the archaic cultures. And then you see almost where the shadow is, there is 3 fishes going down, and in the shadow, 2 years after I did the picture, I discovered that the author wrote to my beloved daughter, which we can't read in the shadow, but I was told that's what it says. This is also Hittite on lava, near a river that doesn't flow anymore. This is the negative version of the inscriptions. They're very fascinating and very beautiful, and to me, this aesthetic phenomenon, yes, it related with photography, yes, it related with writing, but I also related a lot with this new thing we're witnessing, maybe we're not aware of, and we should pay more attention, that we're starting to communicate again with images, and emoticons, Instagram, and Facebook favors for the adolescent a new world of imagery, but how prepared and how cultivated are we about images, and how do we use them? I think there is a lot of questions into this, which I'm not able to solve, but at least I'm asking. It's the same difference between sex and love. This is Christopher Wool. I think this idea of communicating with images can be easily pornographic, and I think we are facing a question about pictures that mean something and pictures that just violate and express something like pornography. A Greek broken page in Arsemia. The tomb of Antiochus I, a very arrogant king that built a fake mountain on the top of the highest mountain of Mesopotamia. And eventually the gods he represented were decapitated by lightning strikes, earthquakes, and rain and wind. This is the highest mountain looking down at the border of Syria and Kurdistan. This is probably 50 or 90 miles from the headquarters of ISIS. I took this picture before the conflict started. I took this picture before ISIS was invented, but decapitation was already in the air. A queen and a prince going to a god that it's in the shadow that was erased by time. So the Hittite figures go towards something that is not there anymore. Double self-portrait of Jeff Wall. And then we finish with some more unreadable Frisian writing, as I wanted to go back to this valley in the center of Anatolia and visit again these beautiful inscriptions like wind or like tattoos that are still undecipherable for us, as I think it's very undecipherable, the present. And the boat of the Greek navy League of Rhodes is also inscribed in stone against a wave of stone. So I think this is the question about the navigability of our culture today. How do we sail, or where are we going? It's a bit the question that I'm asking myself. And I finish with a tribute to, I think, the body of work that has changed the face of photography in the last century. And the Beckers have been, for me, a sort of light through the night. And once the death of Villa is very recent, I thought that it was meaningful to think again of photography as a very ethical medium that can make us rethink the society we live aesthetically. And so I'd like to finish with this.
I've been thinking about your work for a couple of days now, which has been a great pleasure. And one of the things that I learned, perhaps I had an inkling of it before this, but one of the things that was really pinpointed to me, and I think that you mentioned this, in one of your interviews, is that the work has a very emotional basis. It is not work that's in the tradition of a sort of detached topographical imagery, but for you it's an emotional experience. You mentioned love in your conversation, and you mentioned grief. And I also think that the inclusion of some of the paintings from the past, there's a feeling of sorrow, a feeling of sadness. And I'm not sure if this is a question or just a comment. Again, this just sort of emotional bedrock of your work becomes very clear to me. Is this true, Domingo?
This is hard to answer. I think it's true that we're surrounded by very... I think it's true that we are surrounded by very impersonal art and very technical art. So I think that it was... I mean, I don't judge myself as sentimental, definitely loving or interested or passionate. But I think the work is probably romantic in the most dry of and hopeful of ways. I think it's a desire to make a bridge towards something lost or about to be lost, to recover it. I think I've always been fascinated by art that was helping something that was about to be lost or forgotten. I think there is something meaningful in that.
Well, yes, the work is romantic, as you just said, but in a larger historical sense that I think embraces literary traditions and different trains of thought. I also think the work is about disappearance, which I think you just mentioned. That it's as much about the thing not there, or obviously the trace, the remnant of the thing, as the thing itself.
I think it's a lot about that, not only because I am this person, but it's also because the medium I chose and the time we are living are a lot about this. If you think also of our school, Stephen, I mean, only 10 years ago, we were all working in a certain way in dark rooms with a certain tradition that lasted 100 years to get to that point. And now, for example, you had to rework the whole format of photography to attract young people.
Every year we have to rethink it, yeah.
And in a certain way, I think it's kind of fascinating because photography was born, and it is a certain way the perfect medium of memory. It was really kind of born mostly, I think, out of that desire to record, as all forms of modernity and writing. So in a certain way, the moment we kind of got it is the moment in which we lost it.
Right.
I think this is...
well, photography
there's something weird about this passage.
Right. Photography is inherently about the past, immediately. But I also think that one of the things that your work also embraces is the future. By showing us the layering of history, I think that it makes us more aware of the fact that whatever the present is will soon become the past, and will soon be obscured by another layer of history.
And probably the symbols that art can produce can be a bridge to make this better or to make this more meaningful instead of just wiping out or excluding things and removing things.
Right.
I think the wealth of culture has always been the ability to absorb and reformulate and recreate something. It's not definitely destruction. It's the opposite. I mean, recollection is a way to make the gap, I think. I don't know. I mean, I'm not an historian. I do things I love. I don't.
It's interesting to hear you talk about the work also in relationship to what you learned afterwards. You mentioned that a couple of times. I mean, I think your work is such an act of connoisseurship, and obviously there's research that goes into the itinerary and into what you're going to. But a couple of times you mentioned facts that you only learned about a particular site afterwards.
I don't proceed scientifically. I mean, the passion for German photography is mostly aesthetic, but I definitely work like an Italian. I mean, I discover while I do something. I don't anticipate.
Yeah.
I have intuitions. But archaeology, for example, I mean, most of the work I put this mosaic because there is, it's the synthesis of all, especially the bottom part, all the work on archaeology. I really just went to these places and I was sensually moved by them. And then I read. Often I would not read much before to go. Okay. I would see a postcard, I would see an encyclopedia, I would have a kind of
so it's instinctual.
Or a friend would send me a picture, like Lee that sent me the picture of the tomb of King Midas. And then I went there once, I went there twice, and then I learned at SOAS in London with the philologist all this problem after I did the picture. So it's beautiful because I think it's about not dominating but listening.
Right.
So I listen to pictures and they help me, or they tell me stories that I would not know.
Right.
Otherwise.
Well, it's the perfect situation to use photography as a way of learning, and as a constant way of learning.
Yes, because I think photography sometimes anticipates us, or I think our intelligence is really limited visually. So sometimes visual things teach us things, and they anticipate. I think they also relate with the unconscious a lot. That's why that work of Thomas Struth about the city, I think it's very interesting because it's an empty grid that comes to you from reflection. It comes to you afterwards. It's not evident when you see it. It comes from the experience of the photograph or the listening to the sound of the photograph instead of like saying, this is beautiful, this is ugly, this is valuable, this is unvaluable. It's the opposite. It's like, let me use a picture to allow you something.
One of the things I find myself saying to the students pretty frequently is that the photographs are often smarter than we are, or if not smarter,
or stupid, or more stupid. The two.
Right. But I think that they can be the harbinger of what we will know, and the making of photography is a way of learning, is a way of understanding. But you have to look at the pictures long enough to let them reveal their secrets to you.
It's almost, there is something sacred, which I think is also the subject of this body of work. I think that I did not know, but I was really looking for places that had some kind of value beyond my knowledge, beyond my experience, or they just had something valuable that was rooted and meaningful. And I think this is the places where I went to, naturally.
Do you have an interest in American? I mean, obviously, our history, our paleontology is much more shallow than Europe. But I was also thinking of. I mean, you're very generous in terms of citing your references and those whose work you honor. I was thinking yesterday of Richard Mizrak's work, and especially the work that some of the early work that takes place in the desert.
Desert Cantos.
Yes.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
I looked at it probably when I was 18, 19. It really inspired me. Actually, it was the first photographer of whom I heard that was going around with this big wood camera on the shoulder. So this teacher at a class at NYU before I came to SVA told the story of him going into the desert with this camera. I think that was the first person that hit me as an image of somebody deciding to be in the desert with this big wood camera and tripod, and I just thought it was very beautiful.
But why no pictures in the American desert? No, I mean, not that I'm proposing an obligation.
No, I think that this, as far as now, this body of work was very worried about identity. Artistic identity, cultural identity. I think I felt so much pressure to find this as an artist. I don't know, for many reasons, personal, historical, that I think I focused on really the history of my culture.
Right.
So this driving to Mesopotamia, I didn't even understand why I was driving for 3 times by car from the south of Italy to Mesopotamia. Right. It's like the most, I would never accept this journey, not even if somebody threatened me with a gun, to go back there. No, it's like, it was a kind of pull.
Well, you have...
Maybe it changes. I hope it changes. I mean, I hope it changes. I don't want to be stuck in this philologic journey. I'd like to do other things too.
Well, you have been very clear in your relationship to your hometown, Bari, and how influential it's been in terms of a layering of different civilizations, and also about your journey from there.
Yeah, so going out, it's strange. That's very true. It's like the same way I decided to bring pictures of that city here in New York and go to the darkroom on 21st Street and then show in class this picture that everybody found incredibly boring, just because I was affectionate with this place. I mean, Patrick remembers, it was dreadful. It was like the most boring thing, but because I thought they were meaningful for me. So there was already kind of a recovery of some kind of affection or belonging.
And speaking of that era, I think, again, that picture that you made in Mexico City, you know, with the 3 distinct monuments of different civilizations, I really think that was the turning point.
Yeah, I think that was the picture, yeah.
And how you began to understand what your journey was.
Mexico, you see, that's interesting, though, because that was a free step. New York, it was a free step. A step of freedom. Because Mexico kind of showed me a theme that was inside me through his own architectural history or shape. Right. Like it showed me, look, it was like a beaming light on the subjects. Look at this. Then I eventually understood that going back to the Mediterranean was meaningful. Right. But I think early on I was more free than now. I had to, I think an artist needs to cage himself to find out if he's really interested in something. Then maybe you can go out of the cage. I think, I don't know. Well, this is the old way of thinking. Yeah. Probably it's not, it's out of fashion.
Well, speaking of that, I mean, are you going to continue to add to this body of work, or is the body of work?
Well, there is one picture that I put at the end. I wasn't showing it to be, which I did 2 months ago. It's a very ancient bull from 9,000 years before Christ. But I'm also looking at graffiti from the present. So I'm trying to look at the sign as a general thing instead of an archaeological thing. And the drawing is also a much more free thing than alphabet or tombs or very precise gestures. So I don't know. I'm interested in the Paleolithic, but I'm also interested in teenage emoticon. I mean, emoticon and the Paleolithic. I think this is what I'm...
I find that so really wonderful, that your openness to contemporary forms of communication. Which, when I was thinking about the picture of you standing there with a cell phone in front of the tomb, I thought that it might be a bit of a critique. I thought it might be a bit of a satire on the superficiality of cell phone photography. But I can tell, I mean, as you talk about it, it's not. It's not at all.
I think it's the cipher of the Italian photographer, which I discovered very late, Luigi Ghirri, which is being evaluated now. And it was when I came to SVA, there was not even a book in the library, so it didn't exist in the world.
There still might not be.
No, I'm sure now there is. But he said this very beautiful thing about trying to capture the cipher of the age. He said, I'm trying to decode the total hieroglyphic and trying to find out ciphers that explain my age. I think the cell phone is just the cipher of now. And if I didn't put the cell phone, the picture would have been very archaeologic. And I don't want to make pictures of archaeology. And for me, the interest is the present.
Right. Well, putting the figure, whether it's your figure or not, is clearly a reference to the history of photography of exploration in terms of scale itself.
Right. That's why I also introduced Frit. And that kind of idea of discovering time. I mean, we discovered the tool of capturing time and we very early on use it mostly to record forms of time. I don't know. I think we talk about photography so often without the tools and reflecting on its nature of the palimpsest. It's the relationship with time.
Yeah.
It's like it's like wanting to cook without salt. It's like it's always going to be kind of. It's like, I don't know, advertising can't do that because you have a beautiful in Italy now during Christmas is going to be covered of lingerie advertising, all in red. All these beautiful girls in underwear in red. It's an epidemic in Italy. But that photography and that idea of picture, I think it's what dominates our imagery of pictures, willing or unwilling. So to come to the other side and try to make something that comes back to the palimpsest, it's very hard, but I think that's what I'm interested in.
I think one of the ways that you describe that palimpsest is, in many cases, when you make the picture, you are hovering above the landscape, the scenario. And on one hand, that's a conventional way of recording the landscape, but I think it also allows you to layer different time periods, especially some of the pictures in Egypt and in Mexico. So we start with the present. We start with the present, and then show that.
I think probably that was a very didascalic, like a very illustrational need to be clear on the subject. Maybe now I think I'm becoming closer, and I'm not worried about this. I think the layering can be in the message. I think early on, especially using the view camera, you really wanted to be clear on what you were saying. So this idea of being on the stairs or being on a building or being above was the most favorable way to show this juxtaposition.
Have you ever gone to the Museum of Natural History, to their picture collection? They have a remarkable.
No,
the majority of them are 8x10 contact sheets, and it's both a record of everything that's in the museum as well as 100 years of archaeological research.
We should go.
Let's go. I was also thinking about the use of the satellite dish in some of your earlier work. Obviously, when a satellite dish was more prevalent, but it occurs to me that it's also it's a form of writing, it's a form of communication, it's a form of collecting information, and perhaps has a relationship to the emoticon or to the cell phone.
I think it's interesting. I think the fight between this need of communication and this need to be present, this need of the screen, this need of technology. I think that we don't consider that actually the world in which this revolution that it's so slick and so sensual is happening is a very archaic world still. I mean, the majority of Earth it's built in a very cheap, temporary way. I mean, even New York at times seemed kind of shaky and looks more like a city of 150 years ago than now. I think we have an idea of the present and of technology that is very illusionary. I think in the reality, the landscape and the things are much more crude and much more archaic and dusty. And considering that the developed world is a very small amount, the rest it's as old as.
Well, maybe it's a reflection of our own anxiety about mortality, and knowing that our time here is fleeting, and that so much of what we produce is equally as fleeting, is equally as transient.
Yeah, but that doesn't help. I mean, to not find a dialogue with it, also through art or through literature or through theater or through music, it's kind of. To not look at it, it's definitely less.
This feels like for a Sunday morning, a Sunday afternoon, this feels like a very ecclesiastical conversation.
No, we should open to questions of should we?
I want to ask you one more thing before we do that. You mentioned ISIS for a moment in your presentation. I was just thinking of obviously there's parts of the world that are engulfed in conflict, and that has an enormous impact on their civilization and the remnants of civilization. Does this interest you at all as a topic?
to me it's interesting the language they use, or to me it interests a lot this idea of destroying things, and that really fascinates me.
Of destroying things.
Destroying things, and especially destroying this idea of destroying memory. I have a very strange opinion about it. I'm not so...
A strange opinion?
Yeah, I'm not so scandalized about it.
Huh.
I think there is something very...
That's strange.
There is something very deep and very strange in this other culture and in this violence that decides to be so specific to destroy something so precious. It looks like as if a kind of instinct for the times we're living, beside power, beside political tactics, there is something very strange and very deep about it. Of course, I am sad and I am struck. It's terrible, but there is also something fascinating about why humankind decides to do that. There's something, I don't know. I think it talks about the present more than what we can admit.
Yeah.
We Westerns, we can't admit this unconscious because I think they do what we also do.
Sure.
We're just doing it in a different way.
Right. So one
There's
could
something
argue
very instinctual, very deep about the age we live in that destruction. There's something very clear.
Yeah. I think it's very primal.
Very
Primal.
Very primal, yeah. And there is something that we should pay attention to because it's telling something very powerful and very specific about what we're doing to the planet and to the culture and to our own community.
That's an interesting...
Not only their community.
Right.
Because as far as I'm concerned, we are all human beings.
Well, one could argue that we have done as much to destroy not only that community, but also the world in general.
And our own.
Right. That the act of destruction throughout the Middle East might be more explicit or
yeah, or at least I think we are related hand in hand. It's not the evil there and the good here. It's actually, I think we are hand in hand in this. That's what fascinates me. There is something going around, like a kind of common unconscious.
Yeah. Well, maybe in a way that there are moments in your work that really celebrates or at least acknowledges that the destruction of a civilization is an important part in its evolution.
Probably. I don't remember who said that only ruining the ruins you can build again. Some French utopian architect.
I thought John Wayne said that.
John Wayne.
Should we talk?
Branch is coming closer.
Should we talk to these lovely people who came out?
We should.
Any questions or?
I think, you see, the difference between the Greeks and the Romans, which is a huge difference, is that the Romans would find all possible ways to absorb the enemy and take them in their own account, in their own culture. They gave them the alphabet, they made them pay taxes, they lived them their religion. They just, absorb them, like encroach them. When the Greeks, they would not deal with the enemy deeper and after the battle. They were not really colonizer. They said that you need the enemy to be yourself. I mean, the Greeks had this very high respect of the enemy. The enemy is the enemy, I am me. We need each other to be this. We fight, we find terms, but we need this difference. I think the Roman way has got through England, through America, has become our main philosophy, and consider that the alphabet we write and read, and the magazine, the New York Times outside, it's written in Latin characters. So I think Rome is still lingering in its own engineering of power. The Greeks were very different in this. It's kind of interesting. Yeah, but I think destruction is a lot the theme. I mean, I think all these places are about destruction one way or another, or at least it's a common ground. Is coming to terms with different forms of destruction and memory. With memory and photography and destruction, I think they're a dinner together.
Well, and preservation, photographic preservation.
Yeah. There is,
any other questions?
I don't know. It just came to. Thank you, Patrick. This brings us back to Earth. No, it came naturally, I think, to this thing of inscriptions And I don't know, there was something stylistic. I think also we witnessed the disappearance of good black and white lately. It's a part of photography that has slipped out. I thought also in this term, I wanted to recover something. I said, I use such a large format, let me do a little bit of 8x10. It can be beautiful in black and white. So it was purely central thing. And I think it related also with light and writing, even more about photography. Somehow.
But I also think that it connects to the past more than perhaps the...
Yeah, black and white, it's definitely more memory related, yeah. I don't know, Stephen. I think it wasn't a decision. It just happened. It was like going back in time. Recently I wrote a text that that I wasn't inspired, but I had to. And I really sat down and squeezed, and it came this thing of like traveling in time. By the way, 3 days ago is the anniversary of Back to the Future, the film. I mean,
the movie.
The date of the arrival of. I think that's also kind of fascinating, kind of interesting.
Was that the film that he was wearing Calvin Klein underwear and everyone thought that was his name?
Yeah, was that?
I think it's a notable...
And then he was wearing also, I read an article on the plane coming from Milan, that now Nike is making this self-lacing shoes, just like the one of McFly that goes in 2015. He pushes the button and the Nike, which actually is what you buy in Nike Town now. I bought them yesterday.
Are you going to get some?
I just bought them the other day.
I do think that you have gone back into. I mean, it's like an archaeological project. You've started with the surface and you continue.
I think there's also this Orphic thing of death and going underground. Mm-hmm. I think I'm out. Mm-hmm. To not make it. Surely I do it to not make it too boring. When I feel the picture it's too. Serious or too boring, I think introducing I'm also very much in love with these things. So it's a way to be with them. I mean, I want to be in the picture. I do it first for showing this presence. I want to be there. I've gone as far as there. I want to be there. And it's also about being with these things and making them also look like the year they're taken in. Because the coat, the camera, the shoes, it represents 2011, 2008, 2009. So it's not a picture of 550 BC. It's not a picture of archaeology again, because that's not what I'm going for. It's a picture of me in that moment now.
Do you find that redundant to have him in the picture?
Yeah, because you're a friend of mine and you know me, so you're not impersonal. You have to think of somebody exterior. In fact, it's not written in the titles.
I don't think...
No, in the titles it's not written. I say it or I tell the story if it comes up, but it's not a self-portrait. It is unconscious. It is in the picture, but not it's not announced.
Your presence, I think, is pretty generic in it, purposely so.
What do you mean generic?
You just look like a guy.
I am a guy.
Yes.
I like that. I think it's more elegant. Mm-hmm. But if you know me, you see the shoes and the jacket. I mean, there's elements that I like that are. It makes it human. It makes this extreme lost thing more familiar. I think that's the point. I think that's why I do it, to make it more intimate. Mm-hmm. Also for scale, but this is like the same black and white issue.
And you're of average height too.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, when I had heirs, I was even a little taller. I think that it's a big problem to have all these images and these things that are so unhuman in a very human life. There is something kind of strange. I think the human emotional issue is quite crucial. To make something dead alive and human is also the point of a lot of the pictures. Natalie, you have to come before Christmas to Italy and see how many of these underwear advertising is around the city. It's just, the whole country's changed for Christmas, all in red.
and stockings, but everywhere it's incredible. It's like the culture gives its best about photography in this kind of representational charade. It's very interesting, and it's really it's a kind of idea of pictures that to me it's really striking.
It sounds very exciting.
It is, but in Italy there is a lot of these things. I mean,
Did you finish your thought, Natalie? Yeah. Okay. Well, something else that I was thinking about over the weekend is, and I've been thinking about this for a while, that the landscape photography is now, I think, a very vibrant genre, and it can be politicized. It can be, a part of one's therapeutic relationship to photography. It could have be part of a cultural matrix as you are, but it just seems to be a genre and a site that many people are exploring. And in the classroom, I'll sometimes say, well, do you consider yourself a landscape photographer? Just because there is so much landscape in an individual's body of work, and they say, no, I'm not landscape. I don't do landscapes. But
because I think landscape is restrictive. I don't like landscape either.
Right. So you too would say, no, I'm not a landscape photographer.
I'm also a landscape photographer,
Okay.
but I also don't like to say I'm a photographer.
Mm-hmm.
I think
Probably best not to.
I think it's there are categories that are very easily abused or generic. I mean, this thing of making picture with phones and making picture in all possible forms has made the issue of be a photographer and make pictures of landscape or genres very delicate, because you don't want to be in a kind of box of these millions of repetitions. You want. In fact, I consider a lot of the work much more sculptural than picture.
What do you put down as your occupation when you
I don't know. I changed.
come to the United States? Yeah.
Unemployed, which is true.
Yeah. Anything else?
Shall we go to Chinese?
Domingo's taking everyone out to brunch here.
Yeah, but we share. No, we share. I'm kidding. Both.
Domingo, do you know Rachel Sussman's work? She is a fellow SVA graduate. I think she was probably a few years earlier than you, and she has a beautiful book. And the book, she has been photographing methodically, consistently photographing the oldest things on the planet. You know the work?
Yeah, you told me when I came back from that trip about the trees.
Yeah.
We photographed the same trees.
Yeah.
In,
Did you two meet?
and we haven't met.
Okay.
You want to organize?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah. It's been a
And thank you for
such a
coming,
great
guys.
pleasure. Thanks for coming, everybody.
Today I'm honored and I'm thankful with Stephen and Maria to make this possible. New York has given me a passport to my own culture, strangely, and arriving at SVA from a conformist traditional culture like Italy, it was very liberating, challenging, and new. It allowed me to look back slowly and clearly to my own culture, as much as it showed me that a culture can never really enter one other culture. We need confrontation and freedom to find our roots. 10 years after my graduation, I want to thank you guys for this possibility and this lesson, which includes freedom, expression, and art. I will start, weirdly enough, chronologically, because my work, I think, essentially about time. And this is the picture with which I usually begin from 2004. It's the apartment buildings across the window of the house where I grew up. And it represents the suburbs of any city, but in this case it's my city, so it's almost like being in love and being affectionate with something anonymous or generic. But the weird thing is that also my family was part of the entrepreneurial endeavor to build this, so in a certain way, since early on I discovered that the interest that picture allowed me to explore was love, belonging, through architecture and through the representation of what it can mean. But in a certain way, my body of work really begins in 2004 with a very special experience that it's entangled with SVA as well. I was unhappy about making pictures in New York after 4 years. Pictures were not coming out. pictures were not interesting. I was mostly photographing in Italy and bringing back to the darkroom on 21st Street apartment buildings like the one where I grew up or different, but it wasn't really evolving what I was looking for. So one day I met, before spring break, Stephen in the elevator of the school, and he said that there was a small...
Good morning, everybody. It's nice to welcome you here, and it's particularly nice to see some old familiar faces that have returned to honor Domingo Milella. My name is Stephen Frailey. I'm the editor of Dear Dave magazine, and I also have the great pleasure of occupying a couple of different academic positions at School of Visual Arts in photography. But enough about me. Let's talk about Domingo. Domingo Milella, as you probably know, is represented by the Grimaldi Gavin Gallery in London and has had 3 solo exhibitions at the gallery. And he's also had 2 at Tracy Williams Gallery here in New York. His work has been exhibited at the Venice Biennale and at Les Racontes des Arts, which I'm probably mispronouncing, published in the New York Times Magazine, Foam Magazine, Dear Dave, and Wallpaper. He is a graduate from the BFA Photography Department at SVA in 2005, and we gather here today to celebrate the publication of his very beautiful monograph published by Steidl in 2014. Without any further delay, well, Domingo's going to talk for a while, and then he and I are going to have a conversation together, and also including all of you in that conversation. So, without any further delay, please welcome Domingo Milella.
Hello. It's almost talking to family because it's most of affections sitting in the audience, so we'll make it intimate. But I still have to enter the body of work that we will do with just something very brief I wrote this morning. On Mondays, a few blocks down on 23rd Street, during my freshman year, 14 years ago, there was a lecture series. It was one of my favorite classes, to sit in the dark. Here it's a little bit brighter, but there it was darker in the old theater. To sit in the dark and listen to the adventures of these artists. Today go through to also include works of other artists in time that connect with some form of sentimental, intellectual, or just aesthetic bridge. This is Cima da Conegliano, a Venetian painter from the late 1400s, famous for its very cold light. Early on in the development of my work, beside architecture, I was very fascinated by funerary architecture. Also because in a certain way, cemeteries are architectural models of each culture that builds them. And they also cannot be dwelled in the present, but they are dwelled by memory. This, I think, relates to another interesting thing I discovered through photography, which is the relationship with memory and writing memory, which it means also building memory. And the cemeteries of Muslim culture build uniform sculptural models with no sex, no hierarchy, no social class. There was something interesting about this elegance and this uniformity of memory. This is in Albania in 2008. It's a strange picture because it's not usual for me to have people. There are very few, but in this case, for me, this picture was a kind of metaphor. There is a family being portrayed in a pristine forest, and this is early on in the development of digital cameras being diffused in the world, and I could see around like a tree with a large camera settled on the land. I always saw things happening around me while photographing. And one thing that happened during the last 10, 15 years, it was the proliferation of other picture takers, other people taking pictures around me. And this image represents in a certain way this moment of picture taking of the others. But water in the back of my camera springs out of a mountain It's a natural spring. It's called Blue Eye, and this river is born out of nowhere. The main difference between analog and digital is the existence of water. Film cannot be produced without water. Paper cannot be produced without water. Negative cannot be developed without water. Essentially, I think the main distinction between digital and analog is the presence or the absence of water. In 2009, I began probably the most challenging part of this body of work, which was to try to photograph my own country. And Italy has an incredible heritage of image making, and it was hard to do it with photography because also there is an imagery of Italy that regards the sun, the tourism, the leisure, and I wanted to bring pictures of Italy back to some kind of pictorial quality. This is nearby where I grew up. It's called Polignano Mare. It's a city built like a ship. This is a Rorni horn, petrified glass. It's a series that has different names. They are by Rorni horn. They are called, they are cast of glass, baked to a point in which they become completely transparent. So they're only opaque on the sides, and they represent this kind of frozen glass that looks the most similar to frozen water. They absorb light and give light out. It's glass, but it's something to do with photography and water, which I think it's probably the connective element. And also, perhaps I choose some of these things just because they're very beautiful. Even though I came to study in the States, something very strange happened to me in New York City, that I was enjoying a lot American photography, but the true encounter for me was with, as an Italian, New York taught me school in Mexico City, asking us to exchange students. He didn't know anything about this school. He would have gone a few days after, and he said, why don't you organize a group of your friends to go look at this place instead of going on a holiday for spring break, just go to Mexico. And eventually I went there, and I asked him on my way back to Mexico to just move me into this university for a whole semester, and that eventually happened, and this early kind of loss of virginity was through this gift he gave me and the coincidence of Mexican culture. This is the square of the three cultures, where the Spaniards built with the same brick of the Mayan, of the Aztec pyramid, the convent of Tlatelolco, and then the Ministry of Internal Affairs of Mexico built his own skyscraper on the top of another twin pyramid. So in a certain way, it's a picture that shows the violence and the body of colonization. But Mexico was a far more liberating environment because it was a city, a village, an archaeological ruin of the present. It looked almost like a medieval, futuristic city. And when I took this picture, still in 2008, it was Mexican culture that showed me and indicated me a way back to Italy, to medieval painting, to Giotto, as if the city was containing a certain kind of archaic memory. And the archaeology that is taken out of the underground, like in this picture, paradoxically comes back to the underground. This is a subway stop called Beautiful Arts, Bellas Artes. This is also Mexico City. I decided in this prolific presentation, because there is many images we will